So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Gabor, as well, for having mentioned Referent. Basically, I'm going to introduce you to what we've decided to do. It was Dara Makashin and I. We were talking at some points in the Marie Curie Alumni Association because we had heard a lot of stories, and also, unfortunately, we have been through some stories ourselves of having some bad experiences on the Marie Curie programs, and also having heard a lot of students struggle sometimes in their doctoral journey. And we just sat together and thought we need to do something about that. And we seem to be understanding one another. So wouldn't it be useful for people to try to have some form of peer-to-peer support that we could try to set up and organize? So that's really how that started up. So I just put a couple of figures. It comes from a couple of papers that were published by Nature. I know that we all know it, but it's always useful to remember. There is a problem that has been identified, and a couple of evidence that starts to get out about how work-life balance is not always maintained. Let's say in universities, we tend to work a lot, and we tend to work a lot more than the number of hours for which we have been contracted. For those of us who are lucky enough to have, even during the time of their doctoral studies, a firm contract and established status and so on. And all of that, of course, means that it drains a bit our energy, it drains our mental health. But on top of the fact that we work a lot, there is also something that is going on in a lot of institutions, maybe even in all institutions, that's related to us individual researchers having to compete with one another because there's not enough positions available, which doesn't necessarily create an environment where we feel comfortable and we can thrive. And also environments where there is a lot of power imbalance between the students and supposedly the supervisors or the people, let's say, will be in charge of the labs. So we can see a lot of problems coming out of that. I didn't add the data that we have seen from Germany, from N Square, because I suppose that you know it, but it's kind of similar that people anyway have too much anxiety. And I think Martin is also going to mention it a little bit later. But I just wanted to show you that because to me, that screams that, of course, there is a problem in institutions. Of course, we can think that it's the role of the individual to try to manage themselves, and you have to work less, and you have to take your vacations and so on. But sometimes it's just really hard. I mean, we're just little individuals in the middle of a big system. And that's also why Dara and I wanted initially to do something. And we were thinking about the Marie Curie population. I'm pretty sure it's going to apply anyway to people who may be doing their PhDs in their own country. But for us, we had a bit of issues additional to the ones that you usually see as described, because we have to move internationally, which means that you end up somewhere when you don't have roots. You have difficulties to communicate. Most of the time, you also have a supervisor who is also not a local from the country where you end up. So you never know in which cultural frame, in a way, your interactions are taking place, which means it's really hard to adapt, and it also takes some specific skills. We have the Marie Curie program, which can be also for you some different programs or some different types of foundations where you are, where usually fellows tend to believe they have to do something even better than what they would even imagine a normal PhD would be, because they're told that it's so prestigious and so on, so they put even more pressure. They move to the country thinking, okay, I just have to be ready to get on the job, and I just read about the project and I dive into it, and they don't take time to set up their own lives in order to ensure that their mental health is going to be maintained. And by that, I mean making sure that you know where you can find help, making sure that you've set up everything for your own health, like, you know, finding doctors and so on before you get sick and before it's too late. So we don't do all of that. And the same as what I've seen in the German data, we usually have fellowships that are not long enough to cover the amount of work that has to be done to get the project done, which, as I guess the audience knows and maybe has experienced, creates a lot of anxiety. And finally, we usually have some form of interdependency between fellows, or we have to go to do secondments or some form of internships in other organizations, which may help us, which may not help us. It ends up being really a lot for somebody who's just maybe moved across the continent. So of course, then you got to find help. Usually, there's recommendations that you have to go and look for the help that exists within a university, that maybe there will be some form of counselor or something that you have to try to go and talk to. which of course is nice, and it's important that it exists, because on the one hand, you need to have a direct access to someone that needs to be facilitated by the institution. But on the other hand, you often end up talking to people who may know the people or the supervisors, the people in the lab in which you're working. And if you enter a conflict with your supervisor, which may happen, as we all know, there's a bit of anxiety from the student to go and talk to someone within the university. What about confidentiality? How do I know what's going to happen? If you try to find help outside of university, you can try to go and see a therapist, which may help. You can try to talk to your friends, but most of the time they don't really understand what it means to be doing the PhD, and you have a feeling that something is wrong. They just don't get to the bottom of it. And that's why we thought, okay, maybe within our community, we can try to find people who understand what we're going through, and at the same time, who know nothing even about our discipline or about our supervisor. And that's how Dara and I wanted to set up Referent in a way. So we thought we're going to find peers that we are going to be selecting out of another discipline in other countries, but these have to be people with whom you have something in common. So we try to pair you up with somebody who is coming from the same country as you, or has been living in the country where you're living, so that you can share some form of also cultural background or heritage. And that's how the story starts for us. We just try to find a way of matching people together, and we share a bit of their story. So we say, oh, for instance, I've matched, Brian to Gabor because Brian seems to be having this problem, and actually Gabor is so good at that, so maybe he's going to be able to help you out. We help the mentor and the mentee to set up a communication framework. So they have to decide how often they're going to communicate, how they will communicate, because this is super mega important if you want to make sure that the support actually really takes place. It has to be planned. It's not like, oh, one day I feel bad and then I expect somebody to help me feel good exactly the next day. We also train people on how to be good mentors and how to be good mentees, because it's not just having a discussion with someone. It's about learning how to give support and some form of direction in how to maybe reconsider some decisions. It's not about making the decisions for the people who are not feeling good at that moment. And the people who need a mentor, they also need to consider that. They need to consider that their problems are not going to be solved for them, but they need to learn how to ask maybe the good questions to try to move forward. Then we try to support them in terms of the frequency and the regularity of their contact. So we try to check quite regularly that things are going okay. And we help them through some exercises and questions to try to build trust between one another, which is always a bit complex because we have people over the continent again. So basically, they can't necessarily see each other face to face. But from the feedback that we have got from the first pilot that we did, what the fellows are saying is that that type of peer-to-peer support network can really help, because they find something that they don't find in the therapist that has a much more clinical approach, let's say, to how you're supposed to be treating mental health. So they finally find that almost like a friend, and the trust is created by the fact that people come from the same type of network. So, as fellows from the same types of fellowship, we know that in a way we can trust one another, or at least we start with that assumption. So we have had a lot of positive feedback in that direction, which make us believe that there is something more, let's say, in what you can do with a peer-to-peer network than what you would do in just saying, well, go and find a counselor and go and find a therapist. So these are other ways that we've done it. We've learned a few things along the way, which I think are important if you think about trying to find a peer or setting up such a network in your organizations. Which is that, as Gabor said, in a way, as soon as you try to set up that type of program, you will get people talking about the fact that they struggle, which is a good thing to raise awareness about what is going on. And so you need to be ready in a way to also catch those stories and understand how you will help people, because it's not always going to be for peer-to-peer support. You have to think about privacy and ethics straight from the beginning. For us, it's the confidentiality, but it's also the responsibility of the mentor and the mentee. They have to understand what they're getting into. And you really have to scaffold things. So it's not enough to just say, well, you guys can peer up together and you're going to be your mental health buddy. actually people need to be trained. I mean, we all need to be trained into tackling that type of questions. So I would really recommend thinking about that. And at the same time, as beautiful as it is to be able to pair human beings, it's also very difficult to scale. And that's also where the projects of Gabor with Oscar and so on, with the AI-driven platforms, is probably going to be of tremendous help in the future, because it's hard to be able to follow on, thousands of people maybe who may need to be paired together. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Obviously, I'm here for questions if there is anything. I hope that's useful for you.